In this section, we'll do what you were probably here to do in the first place. We'll build a web server in Node. This section is HTTP and being a web server. And we'll take the things we've learned so far, add on a few more fundamental concepts, and finally deliver some web content in Node. Our first lecture is a conceptual aside. We'll talk about TCP and IP, two protocols that are part of the backbone of the Internet. Big word alert. A protocol. A protocol is another one of those things that sounds more complicated than it is. A protocol is really just a set of rules that two sides agree on to use when communicating. So both the client and the server are programmed to understand that particular set of rules. It's agreed upon between all of the code, all of the services and applications that are involved in the communication itself. It's kind of like two people from different countries agreeing to speak the same language. So there might be various protocols involved in any particular communication on the Internet, but an individual protocol is just that, a set of rules that both sides, client and server, are programmed to understand. At least for the purposes of this course, that's sufficient to understand. Now, what do we mean by TCP/IP in particular as protocols? Well, remember the client-server model of computing. A server performs services, and a client asks for them, probably the browser and web server when it comes to the Internet. And there's a request and a response, and both the request and the response are in a standard format. That's the client-server model. But there's a few questions that have to be answered when we're talking about the client-server model, in particular on the Internet. How do the client and server identify each other? And we know there is a standard format for the information being sent, but how is the information actually transferred? That's where TCP and IP come in. So when the client and the server, usually the browser and the web server, connect, you're probably already familiar with the idea that each computer is assigned an IP address, a sequence of numbers that uniquely identifies that computer. And so IP stands for Internet Protocol. And at its most basic, since a protocol is a set of rules, IP means we've agreed that this sequence of numbers will be the identifier for how we connect two computer systems together, how we identify which is which that we wish to communicate with. So that, at its most simplest, is IP. When we make that connection, your operating system's networking ability can open a socket and connect to the other computer. A socket is the line across which information flows, if you want to think of it that way. It's where the information actually flows as it's moving from one computer to another. It's the idea of a socket. And we send information. Now that information normally is structured within its own type of protocol. Whether it's HTTP, FTP, SMTP, the P's in all of those stand for protocol, a particular set of rules for how the information is structured. HTTP for web, FTP for files, SMTP for email, and there are others. But they're all traveling from computer to computer using Internet Protocol to identify. And then how do we send that information? Because while HTTP and others are protocols themselves, we need a protocol to define how we actually send that information, not just how the information is structured. And so the way that information is sent is called TCP, or Transmission Control Protocol. And what that means is the information that we're sending, whatever format it's in, whatever protocol it's used to structure itself, TCP is the protocol that says we'll take that information and split it into pieces and send those pieces one at a time through the socket from computer to computer, and that individual piece is called a packet. So again, the information itself may be defined by a protocol. What is in this package? But the act of separating it into packets, into small pieces, and sending it along the wire is TCP, and because we need IP to know where to send them, we typically refer to both of these protocols together, TCP IP. Now your operating system has this capability, and Node then provides the ability to access those features of your operating system. The ability to create a socket to make that network connection, to send information over TCP IP. And so within Node, we can then define the information that we're trying to send. We typically think of Node as a web server, but technically you could use Node to build an email server, a file server for sending and retrieving files, and more. But at its heart of any of these kinds of internet communications is this idea of TCP IP. Now you might be thinking two things. One, TCP looks an awful lot like a stream, a chunk or a segment or a packet, as it's called, of data being sent at a time. And you're right. In the end, it's the same concept. It's the idea of a stream. And so because of that, Node treats these packets coming along down the pipeline as a stream, and we'll see that later. The other thing you may be thinking is, hey, I've heard the term socket. I know about WebSockets, or the idea of real-time communication on the internet. Well, sockets, the general idea, have been around for a very long time. We use them all the time, the connection between two computers for communication. However, with the internet, we open and close sockets constantly. We ask for information, receive it, and that socket is closed. And then when we make another request, we click a link, we ask to download an image, then new sockets are opened. But the idea of WebSockets, which is a newer idea, is to keep this socket open constantly so that both the client and the server can send information to each other whenever they want. But that's a different subject, actually. But it's still underneath the same technology, just meaning when we talk about WebSockets, we're talking about keeping the socket open. But for the purposes of understanding what we're about to do in building a web server, we're talking about simple and standard TCP IP connections with sockets that open and close, sending information across them. All right, so the web server then perhaps will receive information, or the browser will receive information split up as packets, and Node chooses to see that as a stream. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how Node gets that information in the first place.